I knew something was wrong because she didn't meet me in the kitchen. Eleanor was a creature of routine in the way only people who believe they are flexible ever are. The morning brief over coffee, the evening meal timed to the second hand of the clock on the microwave. Everything took place at the butcher block counter, that scarred island of maple where lists were made and erased, where apologies were offered and silently rescinded. It had always been neutral ground. In my working years, it was where union negotiations happened in my head before I ever sat down at a table. You stood there, you stated facts, you resolved discrepancies, no theatrics, no ambushes. But tonight, she was seated stiffly in the formal living room, the one we hadn't used since our daughter's college graduation party 5 years ago. The room that existed mostly for photographs and resale listings. The room with furniture chosen to impress people who never stayed long enough to sit comfortably. That alone told me everything had already been decided. The furniture felt wrong, as if it resented being disturbed after years of polite neglect. A thick, unfamiliar silence hung in the air, not the relaxed quiet of an evening settling in, but the kind that comes when someone has rehearsed their lines and is waiting for their cue. The air smelled of old polish layered with something sharper. Anxiety has a smell if you've spent enough years in conference rooms. It's faint, metallic, and it never lies. I took the armchair opposite the sofa, the one angled just enough to force my eyes toward the family portrait on the far wall. We were all still smiling in that frame, still connected by something that wasn't paperwork or obligation. Eleanor's hand rested lightly on my shoulder in the picture. Patricia leaned against Daniel, already wearing that confident smile she used for open houses. I noticed, not for the first time, that everyone looked slightly posed, as if even then we were practicing for an audience. She didn't offer me a drink. She didn't adjust her silk scarf. Those were tells. Eleanor adjusted her scarf when she was nervous. She offered drinks when she wanted to soften the ground. Tonight, she just looked at me with that professional, concerned intensity she reserved for stray dogs and damaged appliances. Compassion without intimacy. Care without vulnerability. "Arthur," she began, and that was the first sign of execution. She only used my full name when she was preparing to establish a boundary or introduce a catastrophe. "We need to talk about how you've been." The phrasing was careful, not what had happened, not what we needed to resolve, how I had been. A performance review. I already knew how I'd been. Observant, concerned, asking uncomfortable questions, the kind of questions a retired union operations manager whose entire adult life had been spent auditing procedures and identifying procedural drift was supposed to ask. Questions about the HOA fees that had doubled without a vote, about the sudden, large, unexplained withdrawals from the joint tax account, about why our accountant had stopped copying me on correspondence. "I've been fine, Eleanor," I said. "I've been asking about the $4,000 transfer to P Consulting. That's how I've been." I watched her closely. In our early years, confrontation brought out tells in both of us. She would soften her posture, tilt her head slightly, let out a sigh designed to communicate weariness rather than guilt. Tonight, she didn't flinch. That was new. Instead, she looked at me with profound, almost religious pity, the kind reserved for people who refuse to see the truth everyone else has accepted. "That's exactly what I mean, Arthur," she said gently. "This need for explanation, this compulsion to audit every tiny detail. It's exhausting, darling. It makes us feel like you don't trust us, like you're looking for fault where there isn't any. Us." The word landed quietly and stayed there. I felt the familiar pressure rise in my chest, the urge to defend myself by laying out facts in sequence, to explain that trust and verification were not opposites, but partners. My former self, the one she was comfortable with, the one who spent 10 minutes detailing the difference between a material breach and a technical violation, leaned forward in my mind, already assembling his case. But I stopped him. I leaned back instead, letting the chair support my weight, letting the silence stretch just a fraction longer than was polite. I felt something settle in me, something cold and clear. "Who is P Consulting?" I asked. My voice surprised me. Flat. Even. Done explaining. She sighed then, a practiced sound that conveyed deep emotional labor, the sigh of someone who believed they were doing difficult but necessary work. "It doesn't matter who they are. What matters is that we feel you've been increasingly difficult. Embarrassing, Arthur. Your behavior at the community picnic last month? Asking the mayor's office representative about the storm drain contract? It wasn't appropriate." I remembered the picnic clearly, the folding tables, the lukewarm potato salad, the mayoral aide, fresh out of graduate school, confidently misquoting the scope of work on a municipal infrastructure project. I had asked a procedural question, not an accusation, a clarification. She called it embarrassing. The reframing was immediate and total. My meticulousness was no longer a strength. It was a flaw, a liability, something to be managed. She paused, letting the silence settle like ash, watching to see if I would fill it with apologies or explanations. When I didn't, she continued. "I have to be honest, Arthur. I look at you now, and I don't recognize you anymore. The version of you that I married, that man was willing to trust his family. The version you are now, he's gone, he's difficult, he's suspicious." There it was, identity reassignment. I was no longer the man I had been, not because my values had changed, but because my questions were inconvenient. She was right about one thing. The version she knew was gone. That version had spent decades believing that transparency was an act of care, that asking questions was a form of protection. He was done explaining himself. He was done being dismissed. He was done being framed as the problem in systems he hadn't designed. I nodded once, slowly, watching the flicker of relief in her eyes. Acceptance, she thought. Compliance. Confirmation that the premise had landed. "The children feel the same way," she said, pressing forward now. "They love you, of course, but they need boundaries, for their own peace, for their own emotional safety." The language was flawless. Therapy vocabulary repurposed into administrative control. Boundaries, peace, safety. Each word carefully selected to make dissent sound harmful. There was no mention of money, no mention of power, no mention of the quiet, orchestrated removal of my voice from the decisions of my own life. She laid out the family decision next, not as a proposal, but as a conclusion. Like handing me a finalized contract that had already been signed. "We think it would be best if you let Daniel handle the home equity credit line renewal," she said. "He's an expert in financial security, darling, and we're moving the deed for the cottage in Ohio up into a trust, just a simpler legal structure, for the legacy." Daniel, my son-in-law, the man who had chased real estate trends the way gamblers chase streaks, always one step behind, always certain the next move would solve everything. The same man who had once asked me casually over dinner how quickly equity could be accessed in an emergency. He was now my financial security expert. I felt a certainty settle in me then, clean and unmistakable. This wasn't emotional drift or marital strain. This was a coordinated operation. They hadn't argued about it. They hadn't agonized over the ethics. They had simply run the numbers, identified the obstacle, and moved to neutralize it. They had neutralized me. "The cottage trust," I said. "Who are the trustees?" "Daniel and Patricia," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "It's a very sound setup." Patricia, my daughter. The realtor who had been suggesting with increasing frequency that I might be happier in something smaller, something maintenance-free, something that didn't require oversight. They were removing my property, my access, and my credibility, one professional-sounding conversation at a time. It was clinical, efficient, almost elegant. I stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the polished floor, the sound too loud in the quiet room. Eleanor's eyes flicked to the doorway, then back to me. "Noted," I said. The fear returned to her eyes then, brief but unmistakable. She hadn't expected that response. She had expected resistance, a debate, a long explanation that could be used as evidence. Raised voices would have justified concern. Compliance, delivered without emotion, unsettled her. I didn't give her anything else. I walked out of the formal living room and into the kitchen, past the butcher block counter that had once been neutral ground. Tonight, it felt like a surveillance hub, receipts neatly stacked, a calendar filled out in someone else's handwriting, evidence of a system already running without me. I went straight to my old laptop, the one they hadn't touched yet, the one still running an outdated operating system because I liked knowing exactly what it did and didn't do. It booted slowly, fan whining in protest, and I waited without impatience. Decades of files lived there, meeting minutes, audit trails, side letters, patterns. I had spent my life inside systems, learning how people thought they worked versus how they actually did. I knew the signs of procedural drift. I knew what happened when controls were removed in the name of efficiency. I had been dismissed. I had been erased. But they had made a mistake. They had mistaken my habit of explaining for hesitation. They had mistaken my patience for inertia. They had assumed that because I spoke carefully, I acted slowly. The version she knew was done explaining himself. The version she didn't recognize was already working. The laptop was still in my home office, exactly where I had left it years ago, half hidden behind a row of outdated reference manuals and a printer that hadn't worked properly since the last administration. It was an older machine, thick and heavy, built for resilience and complex logistics spreadsheets, not sleek design or social signaling. It hummed when it powered on, a steady, reassuring sound, like machinery that didn't pretend to be silent. They hadn't touched it because they assumed I kept everything important on the shared cloud service, the one they'd already locked me out of with a password reset and a concerned email about streamlining access. Amateur mistake. My real life had never lived in the cloud. It lived on local drives, meticulously backed up, mirrored, indexed, organized by procedure, date, regulatory code, and cross-referenced by jurisdiction. If someone wanted to understand how I thought, they'd have to read the folders, and they never had. I spent the next 3 days in deliberate silence, moving through the house like a shadow that had lost its owner. I woke early, made coffee, read the paper, and left no trace of urgency. I ate meals quietly, nodded when spoken to, and offered no opinions. They were comfortable with this version of me, the quiet one, the subdued one, the man they believed they had successfully reduced. They spoke freely within earshot now, their voices lowered but not enough, the way people talk when they believe the threat has passed. Phone calls happened in the living room, in the hallway, sometimes right at the kitchen counter. Plans were made, dinners scheduled, concerns rehearsed. I became a prop in my own house, an acceptable inconvenience. "He's just adjusting," I heard Eleanor tell my daughter Patricia one afternoon. Her voice was hushed, warm, satisfied. "It's for the best. He's being very passive. Honestly, easier than I thought it would be." Passive. The word lodged itself neatly into place. They had always misunderstood the difference between calm observation and surrender. I had spent my career watching men mistake silence for weakness right before losing everything they'd built. While they talked, I listened. While they assumed, I mapped. My task was simple, at least in theory. Identify the true objective. The cottage trust and the credit line were not goals. They were tools, temporary mechanisms. What was the end game? Total financial control, complete social neutralization. A narrative where I became the problem, the risk factor, the aging liability who needed to be managed for everyone's comfort. Alexander was the outlier. My son worked for a massive logistics and supply chain corporation in Columbus, one whose name appeared regularly in trade publications and quietly in antitrust discussions. Ironically, it was a company I had advised the union against striking years earlier, a decision that had stabilized operations and saved thousands of jobs. Alexander had benefited from that reputation more than once. He was a middle manager, precise, punctual, deeply reliant on routine. His authority rested not on brilliance, but on predictability, and on the unspoken understanding that his father was respected. I saw him less now. When he did call, it was short, polite, purposeful. The calls came only when Eleanor reminded him. He didn't ask questions, he deferred. He was not the architect, but he was complicit through inertia. Patricia was different, always had been. High-end suburban real estate, big kitchens, tasteful backsplashes, properties designed to signal success rather than create it. She lived perpetually over-leveraged, always one slow quarter away from panic, always projecting confidence through immaculate presentation. Her success depended on appearances holding just long enough for the next deal to close. Daniel, my son-in-law, was the weakest link and therefore the most dangerous. He was the broker behind the speculation, the man whose career was built on borrowed confidence and least credibility. His suits were expensive. His watch was loud. His SUV was always new. He sweated constantly, even in winter, even when seated. Confidence like his had to be manufactured daily, and it showed. He was the one pushing the trust. He was the one pushing the credit line. He was the one who needed liquidity immediately, viscerally. The others wanted control. Daniel needed oxygen, so I focused on him. Observation didn't begin with confrontation. It began with disinterest. The kind of cold, professional detachment an auditor uses when reviewing a hostile department. No emotion, no moral framing, just data. Thursday morning, Daniel showed up without warning. I heard the crunch of gravel before the knock, the sound of tires stopping too close to the garage. He knocked quickly, impatiently, the way people do when they assume they belong. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached for the old garage keypad and started punching in the code, the one I had changed 6 months earlier, after noticing someone had accessed the garage while I was out. He was operating under outdated assumptions, and that told me everything. I was already in the garage. He stepped inside with his key fob raised, moving toward the external drive unit lock where I kept my old union operations files. Not the digital archives, the physical ones. Paper copies of audits, regulatory manuals, disciplinary hearing transcripts, side agreements, proof of competence, proof of memory, proof that I had not simply existed, but operated at scale. He froze when he saw me. The reaction was immediate and unfiltered. Fear, naked and instinctive, flashed across his face before the mask could reassemble itself. "Arthur, you scared me," he stammered, trying to stuff the fob back into his pocket too quickly. His fingers betrayed him. The cheap canvas satchel slipped from his grip and hit the concrete with a dull thud. "Looking for something, Daniel?" I asked. My voice was steady, curious almost. He recovered fast, switching to the approved script, concerned, helpful, slightly rushed. "Yeah, Eleanor asked me to grab some of your union records. She thinks they're cluttering up the garage, making space for the reorganization." Reorganization. The word echoed. Even the space I occupied was subject to restructuring now. I walked the 3 steps to the steel cabinet and stopped directly in front of it, my back to the door. I didn't touch it. I didn't gesture. I simply stood there. My shadow fell across the keyless entry pad he'd intended to use. Silence filled the space, heavy and uncooperative. He tried charm next. "Look, Arthur, can we just be adults about this? I'm trying to help. This isn't personal. It's just logistics. Clean up the clutter." I noticed everything. The tremor in his voice, the sheen of sweat along his hairline, the way his eyes flicked repeatedly to the keypad, calculating distance. I noticed his shoes, expensive leather, pristine soles, the kind that had never carried weight. "The files stay," I said. No elaboration, no explanation, just a statement of fact. He stepped forward, irritation bleeding through the concern. "I have a meeting in 20 minutes. Just let me grab the binders. You don't need these dusty old things." He reached for the cabinet, trying to slide past me. I didn't move my feet. I didn't raise my voice. I extended my left hand and placed it flat over the keypad, covering every number. Flesh and bone over plastic and light. A deliberate act. The distance between us closed. He felt it immediately. This wasn't an argument he could talk his way out of. It wasn't a family discussion. It was a boundary enforced physically, without violence, without noise. He had expected the old Arthur, the verbose one, the reasonable one, the man who could be redirected with enough words. He got the new one. He stared at my hand, then at my face. Something recalculated behind his eyes. Risk assessment, cost-benefit analysis. He realized escalation would not end well for him, and he had never been trained to absorb consequences. His breath caught. Panic bloomed, fast and uncontrolled. "Fine," he said quickly. "Fine. We'll talk later." He grabbed his satchel, turned too sharply, and left the garage at a near run. His car roared to life seconds later, tires spitting gravel as he fled. He didn't even bother with the door. He just disappeared, leaving behind the faint residue of fear and expensive cologne. I waited until the sound of his engine was gone. Then I turned back to the cabinet. The lock opened easily. I pulled out the top binder, thick and worn, labeled in my own handwriting, procedural due process and asset ownership. The pages were intact, tabs unbent, annotations still sharp. Inside, exactly where I knew it would be, was the printout from the family's legal services retainer. Not a basic will, not a simple estate plan. This was comprehensive. Trust formation, asset restructuring, contingency language, dated 3 months prior. This hadn't been emotional, it hadn't been reactive, it had been scheduled. They didn't just want my property. They wanted my legacy, my authority, my narrative. The realization didn't bring anger. It brought alignment, a clean, precise calibration of reality. My wife and children weren't confused or concerned. They were executing a plan, and they had made the fundamental error of assuming I would only ever defend myself with words. I closed the binder and returned it to its place. The explanation was over. The execution was about to begin. The architect of the betrayal was still shielded, obscured behind layers of polite concern and delegated authority. Eleanor never acted directly when she could act through others. She used the children as buffers, as human shields, and the children, in turn, weaponized the language of wellness, therapy, and boundaries. It was elegant in its way. No accusations, no overt hostility, just a steady erosion of my standing until resistance itself could be labeled harmful. They were not amateurs. They were professional betrayers, trained by years of subtle domestic politics. My new phase was defined by silence. The former Arthur would have called emergency family meetings, demanded explanations, insisted on eye contact, and spent hours citing statutes, fiduciary duties, and the moral decay of people who hid behind euphemisms. He would have believed that clarity could still fix things. That man no longer existed. The new Arthur watched. I stopped defending myself entirely. Defense implies a shared framework, a belief that facts still matter to both sides. That belief was gone. When Eleanor mentioned the cottage trust again, "It's really for tax efficiency, Arthur. You'd understand if you just read the prospectus." I simply nodded. I let my eyes drift away. I let her fill the silence with her own assumptions. She mistook my compliance for collapse. I encouraged the mistake. Observation became my work, not emotional observation, not psychological guessing, procedural observation. I wasn't looking for lies. Lies were cheap and plentiful. I was looking for drift, small deviations from their script, inconsistencies in timing, language, and logistics. Drift always reveals pressure points. The first cracks appeared in Patricia's schedule. My daughter was obsessive about time. Every showing, every call, every coffee meeting lived on her calendar. She had built her entire professional persona around being relentlessly available. Yet twice a week, there were gaps. 2-hour windows with no listed activity, always midday, always coinciding perfectly with Eleanor's so-called therapy appointments. Patricia said she was at the gym. Eleanor said she was with Dr. Henson. I verified both claims quietly. Dr. Henson existed, not a therapist in the traditional sense, but a consultant who specialized in emotional transition planning for high-net-worth families. He also happened to be a long-term real estate client of Patricia's, specializing in investment properties and asset migration strategies. Therapy day wasn't therapy. It was coordination, a working lunch, a place to synchronize language, strategy, and timelines without involving spouses who might ask questions. They were managing optics. The second anomaly was Alexander. My son lived inside systems. He trusted them implicitly. Time cards, vehicle logs, compliance dashboards. He believed rules protected him because rules had always protected me. What he never fully understood was that rules only protect people who respect their boundaries. Alexander's company issued him a vehicle and enforced a rigid digital time card system. Punch in, punch out, mileage tracked, GPS monitored. On paper it was airtight, but I had spent decades designing and breaking similar systems. Alexander punched out at 6 p.m., like clockwork. Yet twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday, he checked the vehicle out again at 6:30 p.m. under the category of remote systems calibration. Returned it just before midnight. No overtime filed, no supervisor override noted. That was the tell. High-security environments never allow ambiguous overtime without documentation. This wasn't approved work, it was tolerated drift. Alexander wasn't going home. He was using the company's blind spots. I focused on Tuesday. I didn't tell Eleanor where I was going. I didn't change my routine at home. I prepared quietly. No weapons, no theatrics, just my old dark sedan, the one that blended into traffic without comment. Slightly tinted glasses, a mental map of Columbus transit routes refined over decades of work and travel. Logistics was muscle memory for me. I drove to the company depot early and parked 2 blocks away near a shuttered printing business. The industrial park was quiet, bathed in sodium vapor light. At 6:35 p.m. on the dot, Alexander's vehicle rolled out. A reinforced box truck, deliberately anonymous. I merged into traffic 3 cars back. I wasn't chasing him. I was charting a known process. Alexander avoided the interstate, favoring side arteries and feeder roads. That alone confirmed intent. He was minimizing exposure to high-volume digital tracking. He drove like someone who believed himself clever. He entered downtown Columbus and pulled into a massive multi-level garage attached to the commuter rail hub. Transient crowds, constant motion, poor lighting, a place designed to erase patterns. I parked 2 levels below him, took the stairs, and positioned myself behind a concrete support pillar. I watched him back the truck into a service bay near the tracks, checked his phone, waited. 10 minutes later, a white commercial van arrived. Generic, unmarked, the kind rented by the week. 2 men stepped out, not logistics professionals. Their movements were too casual, too alert. They carried thick-walled containers, industrial grade, the kind used for high-value liquid transport. Untaxed, unlogged. Alexander was running a side operation using company assets, unauthorized transport, cash exchange, a violation so severe it bypassed internal discipline and went straight to termination, possible prosecution. He had always been meticulous about process in his official role. That made him sloppy in his unofficial one. Greed creates blind spots. I moved deliberately, I didn't use the elevator. I didn't use the main stairwell. I took the service ramp, walking with the unhurried authority of a security patrol. The lighting was bad. Trains roared past intermittently. The air smelled of oil, rust, and ozone. Sound echoed unpredictably. It was an environment where control mattered. The transaction finished quickly. Cash changed hands. Containers were loaded. The van left. Alexander stayed behind, leaning against the truck, counting bills with the careless confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. I stopped 3 feet behind him and let my shadow announce me. "That's a breach of Section 4B, Alexander," I said quietly. My voice barely rose above the distant machinery. "Unauthorized use of capital assets for non-company remuneration, contract voidable on the spot." He spun, startled, cash spilling onto the concrete. His eyes went wide, darting for witnesses, finding none. Just me, calm, unmoved, familiar in a way that frightened him. "Dad, what are you doing here?" His voice cracked. "You're following me? This is insane." "I'm observing procedural drift," I said. "Repeated, documented. Your mileage logs are consistent. The GPS blind spots are not accidental. I taught you that." He defaulted to the family script immediately. "This isn't your business. It's personal. You're escalating things. You're just proving Eleanor's point." He tried to step past me, using the cash as misdirection. I stopped him. No punches, no shouting, just leverage and positioning. Years of enforced restraint came back to me easily. I seized his wrist, pivoted, and guided his arm and shoulder into the truck's metal side. The pain was sharp enough to shock, controlled enough to avoid damage. His breath left him in a short, panicked rush. I pinned him in a non-injuring hold. He couldn't move, couldn't turn, couldn't shout without attracting attention he couldn't afford. "I need documentation," I said quietly, pulling out my phone. "Your face, the cargo, the cash." He started crying then. Not grief, not remorse, terror, pure and transactional. "Please, Dad, don't. They'll fire me. I'll lose everything." "You already have," I replied, snapping 3 precise photos. "You just haven't updated your status yet." I released him instantly. He sagged against the truck, breathing hard, rubbing his arm. His key fob lay crushed between metal and concrete, bent beyond use. "The key's broken," I said. "You'll have to explain that to maintenance. I'm going home." I walked away without looking back. I felt no anger, no satisfaction, just alignment, control. I had the logistics man exactly where I needed him, compromised, frightened, and isolated from the family narrative. His secret now existed outside their firewall. The execution was no longer theoretical. It was active. The leverage was silent. I didn't call Alexander. I didn't mention the box truck or the cash to Eleanor. Silence was the cleanest weapon I had left. Threats decay when spoken. They sharpen when left to metastasize in the imagination. Alexander knew I had the photos. He knew exactly what they showed, exactly how long they would last in daylight, exactly who would ask questions first. That knowledge sat inside him like a radioactive core, small, contained, but poisoning every calculation he made. He couldn't speak about it without making it real. So he didn't, and in that restraint, he weakened. I used the time to pivot to the next level of operational attack, systemic degradation. Not confrontation, not exposure. Systems don't respond to anger, they respond to process. I wasn't going to accuse them. I was going to let the systems accuse them. Bureaucracy is the most loyal ally a patient man can have. It doesn't need motive. It doesn't need justice. It only needs inconsistency. My first target was Daniel, the son-in-law, the one who needed the house equity, the one who spoke the fastest, smiled the widest, and watched the clock whenever money came up. He was pushing the betrayal the hardest, and people who push always reveal the weakest structural members. His foundation wasn't just cracked, it was improvised. I analyzed the documents he'd left on the kitchen counter like a careless mechanic leaving tools scattered after a rushed repair. Loan summaries, LLC formation printouts, a half-folded statement from a private lender with a punitive interest rate and a cheerful logo meant to disguise desperation. Sloppy work, predictable for an impatient man who believed momentum could substitute for rigor. The pattern emerged quickly. His real estate investments were bound together by a lattice of small LLCs designed to look independent while quietly sharing liabilities. High-interest credit lines stitched them together, each one contingent on the next injection of capital arriving on time. 3 properties were already failing. 2 were underwater. 1 was technically solvent only because a payment extension had been granted, pending recapitalization. That recapitalization was my home equity, or the cottage, or anything with my name on it. I spent an entire day reviewing his public filings and business disclosures, not the glossy summaries, the attachments, the footnotes, the filings that people assumed no one read because no one ever did, until they did. I wasn't looking for fraud. Fraud is loud. Fraud attracts attention. I was looking for non-compliance, regulatory slippage. The small corners people cut when they're tired, rushed, or convinced they'll fix it later. Every jurisdiction has rules about capital disclosures, beneficial ownership, reporting timelines. Daniel had treated those rules like suggestions. In his desperation, he'd left fingerprints everywhere. Using an old burner email and the research skills I'd honed back when diligence meant survival, I began filing anonymous, legally precise procedural inquiries with 3 separate entities: the state's real estate commission, the county auditor's office, and a boutique financial compliance firm I knew from my old network, the kind that prided itself on discretion and billed by the hour for asking unpleasant questions in polite language. The inquiries weren't accusations. They were requests for clarification. Narrow, technical, impossible to ignore. They referenced specific forms, dates, and discrepancies. They asked why certain ownership structures didn't align with declared capital sources. Why a particular LLC, Redwood Grove, appeared in one filing but not another. Why its interaction with a high-risk credit facility wasn't consistently disclosed. I didn't name Daniel. I named the procedures he had violated. That distinction mattered. Accusations can be dismissed. Procedures cannot. Once a compliance department receives a fact-based query that cites statute and precedent, it must act. Not because it wants to, but because it has to. My former life as an operations manager taught me that bureaucracy feeds on itself. A single inquiry becomes a ticket. The ticket becomes a review. The review triggers notifications. Notifications trigger freezes. No one makes a decision. The system simply proceeds. The effect was instantaneous and invisible. Daniel didn't receive a call from an agent. He didn't get a knock on the door. His family didn't see a headline. His broker received a notice of routine compliance review from an anonymous regulatory body and did exactly what brokers do when uncertainty appears. He froze the account. Not a seizure, not a punishment. An inconvenience. A pause. The first systemic tremor. That pause was everything. Daniel's model depended on velocity. Money in, money out, always moving, always ahead of the next deadline. When the motion stopped, even briefly, the whole structure began to shudder. Vendors didn't get paid on time. Lenders asked questions they'd been deferring. Partners started hedging their language. Nothing dramatic, just friction. Enough to make him sweat. The twist was still forming in my mind, but I already knew Daniel's volatility was the key. He was the most desperate. Desperate men become engineers, not because they're clever, but because they have no margin for error. They build leverage out of fear and call it strategy. I drove out to the cottage in the suburbs of Dayton, the one they were so carefully placing into trust. I needed to audit its physical status. Paper tells you intention. Property tells you execution. When I arrived, the key code didn't work. They'd already changed the locks. No call, no notice. Just a quiet procedural escalation disguised as housekeeping. I stood there longer than necessary, hand resting on the keypad, letting the moment settle. This wasn't about access. It was about signal. They were moving faster now. Faster always means sloppier. I didn't call a locksmith. That would have made noise. I drove straight back. The silence in the car was sharp, ringing with the certainty of my next move. The road blurred into a gray ribbon as I rehearsed nothing. Planning was over. Execution had begun. When I got home, Eleanor and Patricia were in the kitchen, pouring wine like a ritual. The glasses were too full, the laughter too measured. They were celebrating the successful reorganization of the cottage, congratulating themselves on a process completed without resistance. "Arthur, you're back," Patricia said, surprise painted on too brightly to be real. "Did you go to Dayton? It's so nice now that the paperwork is all settled. You can just relax." Relax. The word hovered between us like a misfiled document. I didn't respond. I walked past them, retrieved the battered laptop from the study, and returned to the kitchen. I didn't sit. I didn't soften my posture. I placed the laptop on the counter, opened it, and spoke without looking up. "Daniel's account is frozen." The effect was immediate. Patricia's glass stopped halfway to her mouth, wine trembling at the rim. Eleanor's eyes widened just enough to betray calculation behind the calm. They looked at each other, a silent exchange of questions and reassurances that failed to align. "What do you mean, frozen?" Patricia asked. "Why?" "Compliance review," I said, finally meeting her eyes. "Procedural audit. It happens when you run a business on too much leverage and too little compliance." Patricia's breath quickened. Panic surfaced before she could suppress it. Eleanor stepped in, as she always did, the polished warrior of emotional containment. "Arthur, that is his professional life," she said evenly. "It has nothing to do with us. It's cruel of you to bring this up now." "It has everything to do with the cottage trust you put his name on," I replied. "Daniel is financially unstable. You made him a trustee for my legacy." I paused, letting the word legacy land where it hurt. "Who convinced you that was a good idea, Patricia? Him?" Patricia's eyes darted away, not to Eleanor, to the floor. She hesitated just a fraction of a second too long. That was the moment, not an emotional revelation, a procedural one. The twist clicked into place with the satisfaction of a ledger balancing after weeks of discrepancies. Alexander wasn't the architect. He was guilty of using company assets for a side venture. Greed, yes, but contained. He hadn't wanted to move against me. He'd wanted insulation. Patricia was the realtor, the one trained to see equity as something meant to circulate. She framed it as optimization, as modernization, as good stewardship. But she was too invested in her image to risk open conflict. Daniel was the engineer. He needed liquidity immediately. He couldn't wait for market conditions or family consensus. He blackmailed Alexander with knowledge of the side venture, not to punish him, but to recruit him. He leveraged Patricia's fear of her husband's volatility, fear of being trapped inside his financial collapse, to force her compliance. He didn't persuade them with vision. He cornered them with urgency. The betrayal wasn't accelerated by loyalty. It was accelerated by fear. I didn't expose the mechanism. Exposure would have united them. Instead, I watched Patricia's eyes widen as she realized the truth herself. Realization is far more destructive when it arrives unassisted. She saw the shape of it all at once, the manipulation, the dependency, the way Daniel's instability had infected her decisions. She saw that she hadn't been protecting her family. She'd been underwriting her husband's panic. Her father wasn't reacting anymore. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't appealing to memory or fairness or love. He was executing. And Daniel's frozen account wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a punishment. It was a diagnostic. the first controlled failure in a system that had never been stress-tested. The systems would continue now, each inquiry spawning another, each pause creating new questions. I wouldn't need to touch them again for a while. Bureaucracy would do what it always did when it sensed weakness. It would lean in. The dynamic shifted almost imperceptibly at first, the way pressure changes inside a sealed system before a gauge begins to twitch. What had been a coordinated family unit, targeting a single, inconvenient father fractured into a collection of compromised individuals, each terrified of an auditor who knew where their weak joints were. Arthur was no longer the difficult one, the stubborn obstacle who refused to adapt. He had become the unpredictable variable in a collapsing structure, the one element they could neither model nor control. They stopped speaking around him the way conspirators do when they realize one of their number may already be compromised. I used the next week to deepen the systemic collapse, not through spectacle, but through persistence. Systems don't fail because of one decisive blow. They fail because pressure is applied evenly, relentlessly, until every safeguard becomes a liability. The son-in-law, Daniel, was now calling my daughter, Patricia, every hour on the hour. I could hear the phone vibrate through walls, the frantic cadence of his voice bleeding through thin partitions. He couldn't access capital. His lenders were asking for revised disclosures. His partners were suddenly reviewing their exposure. The compliance review I had initiated had metastasized into a full investigation, no longer driven by my inquiries, but by the internal logic of oversight bodies doing what they always do once activated, expanding scope to protect themselves. Patricia tried to shield me from it at first, positioning herself between me and the noise, but the strain showed. She began pacing during calls, lowering her voice, closing doors she had never bothered to close before. I could hear her repeating the same assurances. It's temporary. They can't keep it frozen forever. We'll figure something out. Each repetition thinner than the last. Daniel's panic was no longer abstract. It was contaminating her routines, her sleep, her posture. Fear, when prolonged, changes people physically. Eleanor waited until the right moment to deploy her final tool. She always believed timing could compensate for weakness. Over a tense breakfast, with the light slanting through the kitchen windows and the table set as if for a normal morning, she tried one last time to weaponize the language of therapy. "Arthur, the children are feeling very stressed," she said, carefully neutral, each word chosen to imply consensus. Your hostility is having a detrimental effect on the family's wellness. You need to consider what's best for everyone's emotional state. I took my time. I stirred my coffee. I let the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle her rhythm. I replied. I'm considering what's best for the legal integrity of my assets. Everything else is secondary. I didn't acknowledge her premise. I didn't validate the framing. I didn't engage with the emotional bait. The lack of explanation left her unarmed. She couldn't classify my response. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defensiveness. It was procedural self-interest, stripped of sentiment. Therapy language relies on mutual recognition. I offered none. For the first time, she had nothing to say. My next target was Alexander, my son. I didn't want him fired. Not yet. Termination would have ended his utility too quickly. I wanted him compromised, suspended between hope and collapse, forced to watch his professional identity erode without the relief of finality. I leveraged the procedural audit I had already set in motion. Using an old high-clearance contact in the union, a man who owed me a favor from a time when favors still meant something, I had the findings leaked not to law enforcement, not to corporate security, but to the Union Safety Compliance Board. The distinction was devastating. It reframed Alexander's actions entirely. He wasn't a clever operator bending rules. He was a liability, someone who had endangered shared resources, equipment, and by extension, his co-workers. Once the union was involved, the outcome was inevitable. This wasn't about punishment. It was about precedent. His termination would come from his own union, framed as a safety violation, not a financial one. That label would follow him. It was clean, it was administrative, and it was permanent within the logistics field he had built his identity around. Alexander showed up at the house on a Friday night without calling first. His face was pale, his confidence evaporated. The expensive suit he wore looked suddenly ill-fitting, like a costume borrowed from a version of himself that no longer existed. He didn't greet Eleanor. He didn't look at Patricia. He went straight to the garage, cornering me among steel cabinets and stacked boxes, the same space where our last controlled confrontation had occurred. "They're investigating me, Dad," he said, voice pitched too high, breath uneven. "The safety board, not the company, the union. How did the union get involved? Nobody knew about the side work except—" He stopped mid-sentence, the implication hanging between us. He stared at me as if the answer might rearrange itself if he looked hard enough. "Procedural drift, Alexander," I said, leaning back against the cabinet perfectly at ease. "Your union contract is airtight. You endangered assets and personnel. That's a safety breach. It's not personal. It's policy." "You did this," he whispered. "You're ruining my life." "You breached your contract," I replied. "I merely pointed out the inconsistency to the appropriate oversight body. You should have been more meticulous. You should have read the fine print." I had read the fine print. Years ago. I had helped draft sections of it in advisory sessions most people forgot ever happened. Something in him snapped then, not rage, panic. He lunged, unplanned and uncoordinated, the reflexive surge of someone who realizes escape routes are gone. He was bigger than me, younger, heavier, but size without control is just mass. I let him come. I stepped aside at the last moment, redirecting his momentum, guiding it the way you guide a falling object, rather than trying to stop it. His own speed carried him into the shelving unit. Not hard, precisely. The impact disoriented him. He struck his head against a cardboard box, stumbled, and went down, the air driven from his lungs. He lay there on the concrete, stunned, staring up at me. My hands were clean, my breathing steady. The confrontation had lasted seconds. It was controlled, contained, and final in its effect. There was no chaos, no damage that required explanation. I looked down at my son, the one who had mistaken my age for fragility. "You should have worn your safety harness, Alexander," I said. It was the cruelest thing I could have said, not because it was threatening, but because it reduced his emotional outburst to a procedural failure. It stripped it of meaning. It told him, in language he could not argue with, that even his rebellion was incompetent. I left him there, on the cold floor of the garage, surrounded by old files and labeled boxes, the quiet archive of competence he had dismissed for years. He was helpless, humiliated, and fully conscious of what he had lost. The defeat wasn't physical, it was existential. By the end of the week, the male threats were neutralized. Daniel was immobilized by systems he didn't understand. Alexander was undone by the very structures he had trusted to protect him. Their power had been derived, not intrinsic. Once cut off, it vanished. That left Eleanor and Patricia. They had framed the betrayal as concern, as stewardship, as the difficult but necessary work of doing what's best. They had believed that emotional language could shield them from accountability, that intentions mattered more than outcomes. They were wrong. The reckoning would not be loud. It wouldn't involve confrontation or confession. It would arrive the same way everything else had, through process, through documentation, through the slow realization that the narrative they had built no longer matched the reality unfolding around them. And when that realization fully settled in, there would be nothing left for them to say. The collapse required a public stage. Private ruin would not have been enough. Everything they had done depended on the continued belief that they were competent, ethical, and united, that whatever reorganization was happening behind closed doors was the natural evolution of a successful family. To end it, I had to puncture that belief where it lived, in front of the people whose approval they relied on to feel real. The opportunity arrived cleanly, almost generously. Patricia, the realtor, was hosting a major open house for a luxury property in Upper Arlington, one of those carefully curated neighborhoods where prestige circulated more reliably than money. The property itself was impressive, but it was never really about the house. It was a stage set, a way for Patricia to display her mastery, her connections, her sense of inevitability. Every appearance she made that afternoon would be a performance aimed at reinforcing the idea that she was ascending, untouchable, safe. All the right people would be there, her best clients, her quiet competitors, the kind of social figures who didn't gossip openly, but remembered everything. This was the audience that mattered, the one that amplified whispers into reputational gravity. If the facade cracked here, it would never seal again. The event was scheduled for Saturday at 2 p.m. I had 3 days to prepare the final sequence. 3 days was more than enough. By then, everything was already in motion. I wasn't building something new. I was aligning forces that already existed. My response had 3 layers, all designed to activate at exactly 2:15 p.m., when the house would be full and attention would be diffused just enough to let confusion spread unchecked. There would be no confrontation, no speech, no moment where I could be accused of theatrics. Only outcomes, arriving without explanation. The first layer was financial and legal. I finalized Daniel's exposure without waiting for the compliance review to complete its natural cycle. I didn't need conclusions. I already had verified facts, all of them sourced from public records and his own careless disclosures. Using a fresh burner account, I drafted a single-page summary that read like a professional due diligence memo. It was restrained, factual, and precise. No speculation, no language that could be dismissed as emotional or malicious. It outlined the specific high-interest credit facilities Daniel was relying on, the missed payments that had already triggered notices, and the direct conflicts created by his role in the cottage trust. It referenced dates, filing numbers, and public documents anyone could request. It made no claims about intent. It didn't need to. The instability was self-evident. I didn't post it anywhere public. Public posts invite defense. Instead, I used a discreet bulk email service, one I knew from my union days when information needed to move quickly without revealing its source. The recipient list was carefully constructed. Patricia's top-tier clients, all drawn from the open house invitation list I accessed through her shared calendar. Added to that were 3 local gossip columnists known for framing concern as civic responsibility. The subject line did all the work. Compliance review, due diligence alert regarding P. Andrews Real Estate. No accusation, just a suggestion that responsible people should be aware. The second layer was social and relational. Eleanor had always relied on a specific kind of language to maintain control. Soft phrasing, therapeutic framing. The suggestion that everything she did was motivated by care, balance, and wellness. That language was her armor, and like all armor, it became useless once turned inward. I had access to the transcripts of her therapy day conversations with Patricia. They weren't formal records, just message histories from the lunches they treated as strategy sessions, disguised as self-care. I read them slowly, without emotion, looking for the moments where pretense slipped. They were plentiful. I selected only the most damaging excerpts. Not entire conversations, just lines. Eleanor dismissing my grief as a narcissistic performance. Patricia agreeing that leveraging my assets was acceptable because he wouldn't use them anyway. And the detail that mattered most, Eleanor admitting she had used her language of concern to push me into signing early trust papers before I fully understood their scope. I compiled these excerpts into a short, unattributed document. No commentary, just quotes, presented cleanly, stripped of context in the way gossip always is. I sent it anonymously to Eleanor's two closest friends, the ones whose approval she sought reflexively, the ones who prided themselves on moral discernment. The subject line mirrored her own tone. Concerned friend forward, wellness and boundaries. The third layer was professional and structural. Alexander's removal had to be final and indisputable. Timing was critical. The Union Safety Compliance Board had completed its findings. I arranged for the formal document confirming gross safety violations to be delivered not electronically, but physically. A registered letter to his company's HR department requiring a signature, impossible to ignore or delay. A copy of the same document was sent to the local paper's business section, framed as a proactive notice regarding workplace safety oversight. Paper carries weight. It slows reactions and makes them public at the same time. By the morning of the open house, everything was ready. There were no loose ends, no further adjustments to make. I spent the early afternoon sitting on a park bench 2 blocks from the property, watching the steady arrival of expensive vehicles. I recognized some of them. I didn't feel satisfaction, just clarity. I had no intention of entering the house. I had learned long ago that the person running an operation never needs to be visible. Presence creates narrative. Absence creates mystery. At 2:10 p.m., my phone vibrated quietly in my pocket. 3 confirmations, the registered letter delivered, the bulk emails sent, the messages to Eleanor's friends received. At 2:15 p.m., the system responded. I waited 5 minutes, long enough for the first phones to be checked, for the first whispers to start. Then I stood and began walking toward the house, unhurried, attentive. I had nowhere else to go. Everything I needed to do had already been done. The street outside the open house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that only existed in places where money insulated people from noise, where the absence of sound was itself a luxury feature. The asphalt was clean, recently sealed, reflecting the pale afternoon light like a polished surface. Luxury cars were parked neatly along the curb, German sedans, British SUVs, one Italian sports car positioned just far enough away to be noticed without appearing desperate. Everything was in its place, and yet there was a palpable sense of unease, as if the neighborhood itself had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. The expensive silence of the street hadn't been shattered by a siren or a raised voice. There was no spectacle for the neighbors to peer at through half-drawn blinds. Instead, the fracture had come quietly, surgically, through the precise deployment of information. It was the soundless detonation of facts, released at exactly the right moment, traveling through private inboxes and group chats with the efficiency of a well-designed system. This was not chaos. This was procedure. I reached the wrought iron fence across the street and stopped. The metal was cool beneath my fingertips, its ornamental curves unnecessary but expensive, designed to communicate permanence and taste. I stood there without crossing, without signaling my presence, and watched. I wasn't there to speak, to confront, or to gloat. Words would have cheapened what was happening. I was there to observe the consequences of procedural failure, to witness what occurred when carefully maintained illusions encountered unyielding documentation. Inside the large, immaculate house, the atmosphere had already shifted. What had begun an hour earlier as polite professional chatter, voices measured, laughter restrained, compliments traded like currency, had collapsed into a dense, paralyzed stillness. Through the large picture window, unobstructed by curtains meant to display rather than conceal, I could see into the living room. The space was staged to perfection, a marble fireplace that had never known ash, a neutral rug positioned at an angle that suggested casual sophistication, furniture arranged to imply conversation without ever inviting intimacy. Patricia was standing near the fireplace, slightly off-center, as though she had drifted there without realizing it. Her posture was rigid, shoulders drawn back in an unconscious attempt to maintain control. She was holding her phone at chest level, staring down at the screen. Her mouth was open just enough to form a silent, horrified "oh," the universal shape of someone realizing that denial was no longer an option. She wasn't scrolling. She wasn't typing. She was frozen, trapped in the moment between comprehension and collapse. Around her, the clients, the rivals, the socialites, people who measured their worth in proximity and perception, had stopped pretending to browse the house. They weren't discussing the imported stone in the kitchen or the custom lighting in the hallway. They had broken into small, separate clusters, instinctively distancing themselves from the epicenter of the problem. Their heads were bent over their own phones, shoulders angled inward, forming temporary alliances of shared curiosity and shared fear. They weren't making calls. No one wanted to be overheard. They were reading. The subject line had been enough. Compliance review. Due diligence alert regarding P. Andrews Real Estate. Clean, professional, impossible to dismiss as gossip. The body of the message was even more effective. Simple statements, dates, figures, cross-referenced transactions, the careful, non-libelous presentation of Daniel's financial failures, paired with Patricia's commingling of personal and client funds. No accusations, no speculation, just verifiable facts, presented without emotion, allowed to speak for themselves. Within minutes, the document had spread through their small, critical social sphere. This was a community that thrived on whispered exclusives and curated impressions, and now it was consuming something far more dangerous: certainty. The PDF was toxic not because it was dramatic, but because it was boring in the way only the truth could be. It reduced years of reputation building to a handful of pages, stripped of context, stripped of excuses. Reputation collapse, immediate and total. Patricia's professional credibility, the foundation upon which her entire identity rested, had been reduced to a file attachment. There would be no clarifying statement that could outrun it, no rebranding exercise that could neutralize it. The damage was already complete. Eleanor was standing beside her, close enough to suggest solidarity, but not close enough to offer real comfort. She looked bewildered, as though she had stepped into the wrong room by mistake. She reached out and tried to place a hand on Patricia's arm, a reflexive gesture she had practiced for years. Patricia shook her off without looking, her focus still locked on the screen. The rejection was small, almost invisible, but it carried weight. Unity was already cracking. Eleanor's own phone buzzed. She answered automatically, bringing it to her ear, nodding as if she were still capable of participating in a normal conversation. Then her expression changed. Color drained from her face, leaving it pale and tight. She pulled the phone away slowly, staring at it as though it had betrayed her. One of her friends had called, the judgmental one, the woman who prided herself on being the community's emotional barometer, who always knew which way the wind was turning before anyone else admitted it. The forwarded quotes, Eleanor's dismissive words, her transactional framing of marriage, her casual minimization of my pain, had reached their intended audience. They weren't taken out of context. They didn't need to be. Read plainly, they revealed exactly who she was. Relationship destruction, complete and irreversible. Eleanor's carefully curated image of the compassionate, emotionally strategic wife evaporated in real time, replaced by the reality of a cold, calculating co-conspirator. The social capital she had spent decades accumulating was gone, withdrawn all at once by people who suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. A client, a well-known local doctor whose name carried weight in the room, looked up from his phone, exchanged a glance with his wife, and made a decision. He gathered her gently by the elbow and turned toward the front door. They moved quickly, but without drama, as though leaving early had always been part of the plan. He didn't look at Patricia. He didn't offer an excuse. He simply walked out, his interest, his endorsement, and his money staying firmly in his pocket. Others noticed. They always did. Inside the house, Patricia finally began to break. The realization took visible form. Her shoulders sagged. Her head shook slowly, side to side, as if she were trying to dislodge the moment itself. She was whispering now, words meant only for herself, bargaining with an outcome that was already fixed. Tears began to track through her expensive foundation, leaving uneven lines that no amount of professional composure could conceal. She wasn't arguing with anyone. There was no one left to argue with. She was understanding the permanence of the collapse. This wasn't a temporary setback. It wasn't a scandal that could be outpaced by the next news cycle. Her career, her primary source of status, leverage, and self-definition, was finished. Licenses could be reviewed, partnerships could be dissolved, invitations would stop arriving. The phone that once rang constantly would become very quiet. Then Alexander arrived. He pulled up quickly, his personal car braking too hard as it came to a stop. He parked haphazardly in front of a fire hydrant, the final procedural failure in a day defined by them. He didn't notice. He had already lost the ability to think in sequences. He looked like he'd been running, his clothes rumpled, his breathing uneven. He stormed into the house without pausing to assess the room, without preparing himself for what he was about to see. "They fired me!" he shouted, his voice cracking as it echoed off the high ceilings. 10 minutes ago! The union! They said it was a safety issue!" His words came out in a rush, tumbling over one another. "I can't work anywhere now. I'm blacklisted." The room absorbed the sound and gave nothing back. Conversations stopped entirely. Heads turned, phones were lowered just long enough to witness the implosion. Alexander didn't look at me. He didn't need to. His eyes darted toward the street, toward the open window, toward the space where he sensed the unseen gravitational pull of his ruin. On some level, he knew. They all did. The three of them, Patricia, Eleanor, and Alexander, were pulled together in the foyer by the sheer force of their shared disaster. The unity they had once displayed, so effective when aimed outward, dissolved instantly under pressure. They began screaming at each other, voices overlapping, accusations flying without direction or restraint. None of it was aimed at me. There was no room left for that. "This is Daniel's fault!" Patricia shrieked, her voice sharp with panic. "His leverage!" The admission slipped out before she could stop it, a truth she had never intended to say aloud. "Don't you dare blame Daniel!" Eleanor snapped back, her own composure gone. "You were in on the trust!" Her words landed with precision, cutting through whatever illusion of innocence remained. Alexander stood between them, hands clenched, his face contorted with disbelief and rage. The unified front they had maintained for years shattered into savage self-preservation. Each of them was trying, instinctively, to push the blame onto someone else, to find a way to be the least ruined person in the room. The consequences were triggering simultaneously: financial ruin, social exile, professional termination. Their entire structure collapsed in a matter of minutes, not from a dramatic confrontation, not from a spectacle of force, but from a perfectly executed, synchronized procedural audit. There was no appeal process for what was happening, no authority figure to argue with. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. I saw Daniel's leased SUV appear at the end of the street, slow just enough to assess the situation, and then peel around the corner without stopping. He didn't dare. He had gone from engineer of the plot to a self-exiled pariah in the space of a single afternoon. He was already running, already calculating where he could go that wouldn't know his name by tomorrow morning. I stood across the street, utterly calm. There was no satisfaction in the traditional sense, no rush, just a deep, steady clarity. The father who had been dismissed, minimized, and patronized was now the villain in their story, and I had earned that title with procedural excellence, not force. The children, who had mistaken my restraint for weakness, had lost everything that mattered to them, socially and structurally. Inside the foyer, the scene had settled into a tableau of chaotic defeat. The wife, the daughter, the son, trapped in a house suddenly filled with silent, judging ghosts. Every carefully chosen object now felt oversized, accusatory. The space that had once symbolized success had become a liability they could no longer afford, emotionally or financially. I turned and began walking away. There was nothing left to see. Staying would have implied attachment, and attachment was no longer mine. My work was finished. The revenge had been lawful, devastating, and unavoidable. It had required patience, precision, and an intimate understanding of how systems failed when stressed at exactly the wrong points. I didn't slow my pace. I didn't look back. The street remained quiet as I moved down it, my footsteps absorbed by the same expensive silence that had framed the beginning of the end. I walked toward the future, one that no longer included them, one that was now entirely my own. The house was too large for them now, and I had somewhere else to be,